What would you do if your family vanished without a trace in one of America's most beautiful yet treacherous mountain ranges, leaving behind nothing but questions that would haunt you for years? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. Picture this: a crystal clear July morning in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Emma Thompson, a devoted mother and experienced hiker, decides to take her 3-year-old son, Lucas, on what should have been a simple, routine adventure through trails she knew like the back of her hand. She was the kind of mother who planned everything meticulously, always carrying extra supplies, checking weather conditions twice, and never taking unnecessary risks, especially with her precious little boy in tow. Lucas was excited about seeing what he called the bubble water, those mesmerizing hot springs that dot the mountainous landscape like nature's own jewels. Has this ever happened to you? That moment when everything seems perfectly normal, and then suddenly, inexplicably, everything changes forever? David Thompson, Emma's husband, had woken up that morning feeling unwell, probably from questionable takeout the night before. Emma had offered to cancel their planned hike, but David, not wanting to disappoint Lucas, encouraged them to go ahead without him. It was a decision that would torment him for the next 5 years. When evening came and Emma and Lucas hadn't returned, David's concern quickly escalated to panic. The initial search efforts were massive. Dozens of rangers, search and rescue teams, helicopters combing every inch of the Pine Ridge Trail system. But the Cascade Mountains are vast and unforgiving, filled with hidden ravines, dense forests, and countless places where someone could simply disappear. The rangers were convinced it had to be an accident. Perhaps Emma had taken a wrong turn. Maybe they'd fallen into one of the many steep gorges, or gotten disoriented and lost in the wilderness that claims hikers' lives every year. But here's what made this case so eerily mysterious. Despite the most extensive search operation in the region's history, not a single trace was found. No torn clothing caught on branches, no footprints, no dropped items, no distress signals. It was as if Emma and Lucas had simply evaporated into the mountain air. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case gradually grew cold, filed away with other unsolved disappearances that plague our national parks. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you and challenge everything you think you know about this case. David Thompson spent 5 agonizing years living in limbo, never knowing whether to grieve or hope, whether his wife and son were alive somewhere or had met a tragic end in those unforgiving peaks. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. Then, 5 years after that fateful July morning, a team of environmental researchers from Portland State University was conducting a routine study on geothermal activity in the area. They were specifically investigating the thermal patterns of Crystal Springs, one of the most pristine hot springs in the region, when their sophisticated equipment detected something that shouldn't have been there. What they found at the bottom of that seemingly peaceful, beautiful hot spring would send shockwaves through the local community and reopen a case that everyone thought had gone cold forever. The discovery was so disturbing, so unexpected, that it would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. But it also promised something David had almost given up hope for: answers. The question is, were those answers worth the devastating truth they would reveal about what really happened to Emma and Lucas in the Cascade Mountains that summer morning? The human mind has an incredible capacity for both resilience and torment, and David Thompson's daily existence had become a masterclass in both. 5 years had passed since that devastating July morning, and yet every single day felt like he was living in suspended animation, caught between 2 worlds, one where his family might still be alive somewhere, and another where he needed to accept an unthinkable reality. Picture David sitting at his home office desk on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday, surrounded by quarterly reports that demanded his attention. But concentration had become his enemy. The numbers on those financial documents seemed to mock him, blurring together as his mind involuntarily drifted back to memories of Emma's infectious laugh and Lucas calling him Daddy in that sweet, high-pitched voice that still echoed in his dreams. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was a complete transformation of his entire existence, a psychological journey that no parent should ever have to navigate. The impact of unresolved loss does something devastating to the human psyche. While other families were moving forward, celebrating birthdays and creating new memories, David remained frozen in time, unable to fully grieve because there was no closure, no definitive answers. His mindset had shifted from hope to despair and back again so many times that he'd lost count. Some days he convinced himself they were alive somewhere, maybe suffering from amnesia or being held against their will. Other days, the logical part of his brain whispered the darker possibilities he tried desperately to silence. That particular morning, as he struggled with those meaningless spreadsheets, his phone rang with a sharp, piercing sound that cut through his thoughts like a knife. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with an Oregon area code, and David's stomach immediately twisted into knots. After 5 years of devastating silence, after countless dead-end leads and false hopes, no one called about Emma and Lucas anymore. The case had gone cold, filed away in some dusty cabinet, forgotten by everyone except the man who lived with their absence every single day. His hand trembled slightly as he answered, and the voice on the other end would change everything he thought he knew about that fateful day. Detective Maria Santos from the Summit County Sheriff's Office spoke with the kind of professional calm that only comes from years of delivering life-altering news to families. But there was something different in her tone, an urgency that made David's heart race even as she carefully chose her words. The revelation that researchers had discovered something in Crystal Springs, that peaceful, beautiful hot spring where his family had visited countless times, sent shockwaves through David's carefully constructed emotional barriers. This wasn't just another false lead or well-meaning tip from a hiker who thought they'd seen something. This was concrete evidence, physical proof that would finally provide answers to questions that had consumed 5 years of his life. But here's the hidden truth about getting the answers you've desperately wanted for years. Sometimes those revelations come with a price you never anticipated paying. Sometimes the journey toward closure takes you through territories of human darkness that you never imagined existed. The transformation that happens when you receive life-altering news is instantaneous and irreversible. Detective Santos's words hit David like a physical blow. Environmental scientists from Portland State University had been conducting routine research on geothermal activity at Crystal Springs when their sophisticated equipment detected something that should never have been there. What started as a simple scientific study of mineral deposits and bacterial formations had become a crime scene investigation that would shatter David's world all over again. These researchers weren't looking for human remains. They were taking core samples to study the unique thermal ecosystem that makes Crystal Springs such a fascinating natural phenomenon. But their magnetometer began registering metallic anomalies at depths that made no geological sense. When they investigated further, what they discovered sent shockwaves through their entire team. At the bottom of those pristine, seemingly peaceful thermal waters, they found fabric remnants, pieces of hiking gear, and organic material that would require DNA confirmation to identify. The impact of this revelation sent David's mind racing back to that fateful morning 5 years ago, and suddenly every decision from that day took on a devastating new significance. The hidden truth about trauma is that it doesn't just live in your present. It rewrites your entire past, making you question every choice, every moment, every seemingly innocent decision that led to catastrophe. That July morning had started like countless others. David remembered, waking up feeling absolutely terrible, his body racked with fever and chills from what was probably food poisoning caused by the questionable Chinese takeout they'd ordered the night before. Emma, being the thoughtful and caring partner she always was, had immediately suggested canceling their planned family hike to give David time to recover. But here's where the journey of regret begins. David had insisted they go ahead without him, not wanting to disappoint Lucas, who had been bouncing around the house with excitement about seeing the bubble water. The mindset shift that happens when you realize your decisions played a role in tragedy is something that changes the very fabric of who you are. If David had just said yes to Emma's suggestion to stay home, if he had prioritized his health over Lucas's temporary disappointment, if he had trusted his instincts and kept his family close that day, everything would have been different. This is the psychological torture that survivors live with, the endless loop of what-ifs that becomes a prison of their own making. Lucas's pure, childlike enthusiasm for those hot springs had been infectious. At 3 years old, he called them bubble water and was fascinated by the colors, the steam, the magical quality of water that seemed to glow from within. Emma had promised to take photos and videos to show David later, planning to make it a special mother-son adventure that would become a cherished memory. Neither of them could have imagined that Crystal Springs would become not a source of wonder, but a tomb that would hide Emma's fate for 5 long years. The science behind what those researchers discovered is both fascinating and horrifying. Crystal Springs, with its extreme temperatures averaging 160 degrees Fahrenheit and unique mineral composition, creates an environment unlike anywhere else on Earth. The high heat and acidic mineral content act as both destroyer and preserver, breaking down organic material in ways that traditional decomposition never could, while simultaneously preserving certain elements in unexpected ways. This thermal environment had become an unintentional time capsule, holding secrets that would transform everything about this case. When the team carefully extracted their findings, piece by piece, the evidence painted a picture that defied the original accident theory. They recovered fabric remnants that were unmistakably consistent with high-quality hiking gear, the kind that serious outdoor enthusiasts invest in for safety and durability. There was a corroded but recognizable backpack frame, leather fragments from what appeared to be hiking boots, and organic material that would require extensive DNA testing to confirm identity. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. The distribution pattern of these items suggested something far more sinister than an accidental fall. The psychological impact on David when Detective Santos insisted on an in-person meeting cannot be overstated. After 5 years of living in limbo, suddenly being thrust back into active investigation mode triggered a complete mindset shift. Within hours, he was booking the 2:30 flight to Portland, his hands shaking as he typed credit card information into airline websites, the adrenaline of potential answers mixed with the terror of what those answers might reveal, creating an emotional cocktail that left him simultaneously hopeful and nauseated. As David moved through his house mechanically packing clothes and identification documents, he passed the photo gallery that Emma had lovingly created in their hallway. Dozens of frames showcased their adventures together. Lucas on David's shoulders at Garden of the Gods, Emma laughing as she struggled with tent setup in a windstorm, and there, among all the happy memories, photos of the 3 of them at Crystal Springs from the summer before they disappeared. The behind-the-scenes story of their relationship was captured in these images: Emma's meticulous planning, Lucas's infectious excitement, David's quiet contentment at being part of such a loving family unit. The journey David was about to embark on represented more than just a flight to Oregon. This was a pilgrimage back to the last place his family had been seen alive, but now armed with knowledge that would fundamentally alter his understanding of what happened that day. The transformation from hoping for rescue to seeking justice was beginning, though David didn't yet realize the full scope of revelations awaiting him. Detective Santos had been deliberately vague about certain aspects of the discovery, and David could sense there were hidden truths she wasn't sharing over the phone. The way she carefully chose her words, the pauses between sentences, the insistence on face-to-face discussion, all of these details suggested the evidence contained implications that went far beyond a simple accident. The irony of Emma's extensive knowledge about Crystal Springs would prove to be one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire tragedy. This wasn't some random location where an inexperienced hiker had stumbled into danger. Crystal Springs had been a cherished family destination, a place where Emma, David, and Lucas had created countless beautiful memories together. Emma was the kind of person who researched everything meticulously, and she had made it her mission to understand every aspect of the places they visited, especially when it came to safety considerations with a young child. The transformation from beautiful family destination to crime scene creates a psychological impact that's almost impossible to process. Emma had actually read David detailed statistics about hot spring safety, explaining how the extreme temperatures could overcome the human body in mere minutes, and how the unique mineral composition created an environment where organic material never fully decomposes. She spoke about these facts with the clinical fascination of someone who appreciated nature's power while respecting its dangers. The hidden truth that would emerge later was that someone had used Emma's own knowledge against her, weaponizing her understanding of this pristine environment. When David's plane touched down in Portland, the familiar landscape of the Pacific Northwest felt both comforting and ominous. Detective Maria Santos was waiting at the arrivals area, and her appearance immediately conveyed the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't some small-town officer out of her depth. Santos was clearly a seasoned professional in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her. Her practical clothing, designed for mountain terrain, sent a clear message that she understood the challenges of working in wilderness environments. The 2-hour drive from Portland to the investigation site would become a journey of gradual revelation, though David didn't realize it yet. Santos maintained professional composure while carefully sharing information, but there was something in her demeanor that suggested she was holding back significant details. Her no-nonsense approach was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it indicated competence, but concerning because of what it implied about the complexity of what they discovered. As they drove through increasingly remote terrain, Santos began sharing preliminary forensics, findings that would fundamentally alter David's understanding of that fateful day. The way evidence was distributed throughout Crystal Springs defied normal accident patterns, suggesting instead a deliberate placement that required intimate knowledge of the thermal spring's unique characteristics. Someone had understood exactly how that environment would affect preservation and used that knowledge strategically. The mindset shift David experienced during this drive was profound. For 5 years, he'd oscillated between hoping his family was alive somewhere and grieving their presumed accidental deaths. But now, faced with evidence of potential foul play, he had to confront an entirely different possibility: that Emma and Lucas had been victims of a calculated crime by someone who knew these mountains intimately. The transformation of a routine scientific expedition into a criminal investigation reveals how quickly our understanding of reality can shift. Dr. Emily Reeves, a respected environmental scientist from Portland State University, had been leading what was supposed to be a straightforward thermal study when everything changed 3 days earlier. Her team was investigating bacterial formations and mineral deposits in Crystal Springs, the kind of research that contributes to our understanding of geothermal ecosystems. But when their sophisticated equipment began registering anomalies that made no geological sense, they found themselves at the center of a mystery that had haunted the region for 5 years. The professionalism with which Dr. Reeves and her team handled the discovery speaks to their character and training. The moment they realized they'd found human remains, they immediately contacted authorities and stepped back, preserving the integrity of what had suddenly become a crime scene. This wasn't treasure hunting or amateur investigation. These were serious scientists who understood the gravity of their findings and the importance of proper protocol. The impact of seeing the Pine Ridge Trail System transformed into an active investigation site was overwhelming for David. What had once been a peaceful parking area where families gathered for weekend adventures was now cordoned off with yellow police tape, multiple law enforcement vehicles clustered near the trailhead like mechanical sentries guarding secrets. The familiar landscape that held so many beautiful memories with Emma and Lucas had been transformed into something that felt alien and foreboding. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, hitting that subscribe button ensures you'll never miss when we dive deep into another mystery that challenges everything you thought you knew about human nature. The 2-mile hike to Crystal Springs stretched endlessly ahead of David, each step carrying him closer to confronting the physical evidence of his family's fate. This wasn't the eager anticipation he'd felt on previous visits when Lucas would bounce ahead, pointing out interesting rocks and asking endless questions about everything he saw. This was a pilgrimage of grief, a journey toward answers that he'd desperately wanted but now feared receiving. The psychological journey David experienced during this hike was profound. With every familiar landmark, the fallen log where Lucas liked to practice his balance, the rocky outcrop where Emma always stopped to take photos, the bend in the trail where Crystal Springs first came into view, his mindset shifted between past joy and present dread. The same path that had once represented family adventure and connection with nature now felt like a march toward confirmation of his worst fears. As they approached the investigation site, David could hear the organized activity of a major forensics operation. Voices coordinating evidence collection, equipment humming, the sound of professionals methodically documenting every detail. The behind-the-scenes work of solving a crime is painstaking and thorough, but for a family member, each careful procedure represents another step toward understanding what happened to their loved ones. The psychological impact of seeing a place you love transformed into a crime scene cannot be overstated. Crystal Springs looked exactly as it had during every family visit. That perfect circle of brilliant, almost supernatural colors radiating from the deep blue center that had captivated Lucas's imagination and sparked Emma's scientific curiosity. The natural beauty remained unchanged. Those mesmerizing yellows and greens created by thermophilic bacteria that thrive in extreme heat, the steam rising like spirits from the mineral-rich waters. But now this peaceful natural wonder was surrounded by investigation equipment that created a jarring contrast between nature's serenity and human tragedy. A specialized diving platform had been constructed over one edge of the springs, its metal framework looking alien against the organic curves of the thermal pool. Recovery specialists in protective gear worked methodically around the perimeter, their movements careful and reverent as they processed what had become both a crime scene and a tomb. The transformation from family destination to forensic site represented a fundamental shift in how David would forever view this place that had once brought his family such joy. Dr. Emily Reeves approached with the measured demeanor of someone who understood the gravity of accidental discovery. Her University of Colorado jacket was mud-stained from days of fieldwork, and her expression carried the weight of someone who had stumbled upon tragedy while pursuing scientific knowledge. The behind-the-scenes story of how they made this discovery reveals the random nature of how hidden truths sometimes emerge after years of concealment. The revelation process began when Dr. Reeves explained their original mission with scientific precision. Her team had been taking core samples of the bacterial mats that create Crystal Springs' famous coloration, studying how these unique microorganisms adapt to extreme thermal conditions. This was routine environmental research, the kind of work that contributes to our understanding of life in extreme environments and potential applications for biotechnology. But when their magnetometer began detecting metallic anomalies at significant depth, everything changed. The mindset shift from scientific discovery to criminal investigation happened in an instant. Protocol required investigating any anomalies that might affect their data integrity, so they carefully probed deeper into areas where their instruments indicated foreign materials. What they found defied all expectations and would haunt everyone involved in the recovery process. The equipment that was designed to study bacterial formations instead became the key to unlocking a 5-year-old mystery. The impact on Dr. Reeves and her team was profound. These scientists had dedicated their careers to understanding natural processes, not uncovering human tragedy. Yet their commitment to scientific rigor and proper procedure had inadvertently solved a case that law enforcement had been unable to crack for half a decade. The journey from routine research to criminal evidence collection required a complete transformation in how they approached their work at the site. The transformation that happens when you see your loved one's belongings preserved as evidence in a criminal investigation is something no amount of mental preparation can cushion. Inside the temporary evidence tent set up 30 yards from Crystal Springs, tables held carefully labeled items that told a story David had never imagined possible. Emma's backpack frame was unmistakable despite the corrosion from 5 years in extreme thermal conditions, its distinctive aluminum construction still recognizable even after enduring temperatures that would destroy most materials. The purple fabric remnants, still clinging to parts of the frame, created a visceral connection to that final day. Emma had chosen that particular backpack because of its weight distribution and durability, spending weeks researching the best gear for hiking with Lucas. She'd been so proud of that purchase, explaining to David how the frame design would make carrying emergency supplies more comfortable during long hikes with their son. Now, those same design features that had once represented safety and preparation were being documented as evidence in what was clearly no longer considered an accident. The hidden truth behind what Dr. Reeves's magnetometer had detected began to emerge as investigators explained their findings. The backpack's metal frame had triggered their research instruments, but it was the depth and position of the items that sent chills through everyone involved. The evidence wasn't scattered randomly as would be expected from an accidental fall. Instead, everything suggested deliberate placement at significant depth, indicating that someone had weighted down Emma's belongings to ensure they would sink and remain hidden. This revelation fundamentally altered the entire investigation and David's understanding of what had happened to his family. The mindset shift from grieving an accident to confronting deliberate murder was psychologically devastating. For 5 years, David had tortured himself with what-ifs about whether he could have prevented a tragic accident. But now he was facing evidence that someone had deliberately killed his wife and gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal the crime. That like button helps more people discover these in-depth investigations. And honestly, knowing this resonated with you makes all the research and careful storytelling worthwhile. The impact of realizing that Emma's death was intentional created a storm of emotions David hadn't anticipated. Rage mixed with renewed grief, while questions multiplied exponentially. Who would have done this to Emma? How had they overpowered someone as cautious and prepared as she was? Most critically, what had happened to Lucas? The absence of any child-related items in the recovery suggested possibilities that were both hopeful and terrifying. The behind-the-scenes investigation was revealing patterns that defied the original accident theory. The way items were distributed throughout Crystal Springs required intimate knowledge of how the thermal environment would affect evidence preservation. Someone had understood exactly how those extreme temperatures and mineral compositions would impact organic material, while leaving metal components detectable by future scientific equipment. The journey of discovering personal items that belong to your loved one in a criminal investigation creates an emotional impact that defies description. Each recovered piece told a story of Emma's final moments, but also revealed the calculated nature of what had been done to her. Her hiking boots, those sturdy companions that had carried her across countless mountain trails, still contained the custom orthotic insoles she'd had made to support her high arches. These weren't random pieces of gear. They were intimate details of a woman who planned meticulously for every adventure. Her car keys, still bearing the dealership fob from when they'd bought their family SUV 3 years earlier, represented the mundane reality she'd expected to return to. Emma had planned to drive home that evening, probably stopping for ice cream with Lucas as she often did after their hiking adventures. The transformation from routine family outing to calculated murder was evidenced in every carefully preserved item that investigators laid out for identification. But it was Emma's titanium wedding ring that delivered the most devastating emotional blow. David picked up the evidence bag with trembling hands, reading the inscription that was still clearly visible despite 5 years in extreme thermal conditions. To the summit and back, D and E, their private joke about navigating life's peaks and valleys together, engraved when they'd gotten married on Loveland Pass 7 years earlier. That ring represented their commitment to face every challenge as a team, yet she'd faced her final moments alone. The hidden truth about Emma's death became even more disturbing when investigators explained the unusual submersion pattern. The position and distribution of items suggested that Emma had entered Crystal Springs fully clothed with all her gear intact, a scenario that defied every known pattern of accidental hot spring deaths. This wasn't the typical tragedy where someone slips while taking photos or leans too far over the edge. This was complete submersion under circumstances that required careful analysis. The behind-the-scenes forensics revealed that most accidental victims of hot spring incidents enter the water partially. A foot slips on wet rocks, someone reaches for a dropped item, or they lose balance while trying to get the perfect photograph. But Emma's case showed full immersion while wearing heavy hiking boots, carrying a loaded backpack, and maintaining possession of all her personal items. This pattern suggested either a deliberate decision to enter the water, which was completely contrary to her safety-conscious nature, or that she'd been forced into the spring against her will. The mindset shift required to process this information was profound. David had spent 5 years wondering if Emma had made a momentary lapse in judgment that cost her life, but now he was confronting evidence that someone had deliberately murdered his wife and used their intimate knowledge of Crystal Springs' unique preservation properties to hide the crime. The revelation that this was calculated and intentional opened disturbing new questions about who could have done this and what their motivations might have been. The transformation of understanding Emma's character from victim to someone who was deliberately targeted became crucial to solving this case. David's emphasis on his wife's safety consciousness wasn't just grief-talking. It was based on years of witnessing her meticulous approach to every outdoor adventure. Emma had studied Crystal Springs extensively, reading geological surveys, safety reports, and incident statistics. She knew exactly how close was too close, especially when Lucas was with her. Her obsessive attention to detail meant she always maintained safe distances from thermal features, often annoying other hikers by insisting they stay further back than seemed necessary. This mindset of extreme caution made the full submersion evidence even more suspicious. Emma wasn't the type to lean over for a better photo or test water temperatures with her hand. She'd taught Lucas to stay at least 10 feet away from any thermal feature, and she followed her own rules religiously. The idea that she would have accidentally fallen while wearing full hiking gear defied everything David knew about his wife's personality and habits. The journey into the trail register investigation revealed both hope and frustration. Emma's signature at 8:47 a.m. was clear and confident, showing no signs of distress or hurry. But the Pine Ridge Trail System's complexity presented enormous challenges for finding potential witnesses. With dozens of interconnecting paths used by hundreds of people daily during peak summer season, the task of tracking down anyone who might have seen Emma and Lucas that specific morning seemed nearly impossible after 5 years. The impact of time on witness memories and availability created additional obstacles. People move, change phone numbers, forget details, or simply don't realize the significance of what they might have observed. The behind-the-scenes investigation would require reaching out to hiking clubs, outdoor photography groups, and anyone who regularly used those trails during that time frame. Detective Santos was essentially trying to reconstruct a single day from 5 years ago using fragmented memories and incomplete records, but there was something else hidden in the trail register data that investigators found intriguing. Emma had signed in alone with Lucas, but the timing and location suggested they might have encountered other hikers or park personnel during their trek. The revelation that emerged from analyzing entry and exit times showed several other parties were in the area that morning, including park maintenance staff who had been conducting routine operations on the trail system. The transformation from missing persons case to criminal investigation required a complete shift in how authorities approached potential witnesses. Instead of asking if anyone had seen a lost family, they were now looking for people who might have witnessed a crime in progress or observed suspicious behavior around Crystal Springs. This change in perspective would soon lead to discoveries that had been overlooked for 5 years. Join our community by subscribing. We're building something special here where we explore the complex psychology behind real cases with the respect and thoroughness these stories deserve. The absence of evidence can sometimes be more revealing than what's actually found, and in Lucas's case, this principle would prove to be absolutely crucial. The transformation in how investigators viewed this case hinged on one startling realization. There was no trace of a 3-year-old child anywhere in Crystal Springs. No tiny hiking boots, no remnants of the specialized child carrier that Emma always used for long hikes, no sippy cups, snacks, or any of the dozens of items that conscientious parents pack when adventuring with toddlers. This revelation created a profound shift in the investigation's mindset. If both Emma and Lucas had entered the thermal spring together, whether accidentally or by force, there should have been evidence of the child. The fact that only adult-related items were recovered suggested something that was both hopeful and terrifying. Lucas might not have been with his mother when she died. This possibility opened entirely different scenarios about what happened that morning. Scenarios that required investigators to completely reimagine the sequence of events. The impact of this discovery on David was overwhelming. For 5 years, he had grieved the loss of both his wife and son, believing they had died together in some tragic accident. But now, faced with evidence that Lucas might have been separated from Emma before her death, a spark of hope ignited that he hadn't allowed himself to feel since that devastating day. If his son hadn't been in Crystal Springs when Emma was killed, then Lucas might still be alive somewhere. Detective Santos made the decision to officially reopen the case as a criminal investigation, fundamentally transforming how they would approach every aspect of the evidence. This wasn't just about finding answers for a grieving family anymore. This was about solving a murder and potentially locating a missing child who could still be alive after 5 years. The behind-the-scenes implications of this shift were enormous, requiring resources, personnel, and investigative techniques that hadn't been employed during the original missing persons case. The journey ahead would involve interviewing everyone connected to the Pine Ridge Trail system, park, employees, regular hikers, maintenance staff, and anyone who might have been in the area that morning. The hidden truth that investigators were now pursuing was much more complex than an accidental death. Someone had deliberately killed Emma, concealed her body in Crystal Springs, and potentially taken Lucas. The question was whether that someone had acted out of opportunity or had been specifically targeting this family. The revelation that Lucas might be alive somewhere created an urgency that hadn't existed when this was presumed to be a recovery operation. Every day that passed was another day that the trail grew colder, another day that a child remained separated from his father. But it was also another day of hope that David hadn't dared to embrace for half a decade. The transformation from a cold case to an active criminal investigation created an energy that was palpable when David arrived at the Pine Ridge Trail parking area the next morning. The command center, established by dawn, resembled a military operation, with search and rescue personnel gathered around topographical maps spread across folding tables. The morning air carried that distinctive scent of pine and possibility, but David's fluorescent vest marked family served as a constant reminder of the personal stakes involved in this massive undertaking. Detective Santos had orchestrated a systematic approach that reflected her understanding of how crimes unfold in wilderness settings. The grid searches were based on possible routes Emma might have taken, but now they were also considering scenarios where she might have sought shelter or been forced to deviate from her planned path. Every structure within a 5-mile radius would be examined with fresh eyes and new purpose. Emergency shelters, maintenance sheds, old mining cabins, and any other buildings that could have provided refuge during unexpected weather. The mindset shift from searching for accident victims to investigating a potential crime scene changed everything about how they approached these locations. Emergency shelters that had been quickly checked during the original search were now being processed as potential crime scenes. The behind-the-scenes investigation revealed that these structures maintained logbooks where hikers recorded their stays, documents that hadn't been thoroughly examined 5 years earlier when everyone assumed this was a simple case of people getting lost in the wilderness. The impact of this more thorough approach became evident as teams began reporting their findings. These shelters weren't just emergency refuges. They were meeting points where strangers might encounter each other during storms, places where someone with malicious intent could isolate victims far from help. The journey toward understanding what happened to Emma and Lucas was leading investigators into the hidden infrastructure of the trail system, places that most casual hikers never see, but that could hold crucial evidence. What made this search particularly significant was the revelation that the day Emma and Lucas disappeared had included unexpected weather patterns. Afternoon storms had moved through the area, exactly the kind of conditions that would send responsible parents with young children seeking immediate shelter. Emma's safety-conscious nature meant she would have known the locations of every emergency structure in the area, and, more importantly, she would have used them if conditions warranted. The transformation in David's role from passive victim to active participant in the investigation gave him purpose he hadn't felt in years. Walking these trails again, seeing the systematic approach to uncovering truth, feeling the dedication of the search teams, it all contributed to a mindset of determination rather than despair. Each shelter they checked, each structure they processed, brought them closer to answers that had been hidden for half a decade. If this deep dive into the case kept you engaged from start to finish, a quick tap on the like button tells me you value this kind of detailed, respectful approach to true crime storytelling. The transformation that occurs when a seemingly helpful witness reveals information that should have been discovered years earlier can completely shift an investigation's trajectory. Ranger Robert Hayes approached the command center with the kind of weathered confidence that comes from spending 15 years navigating these mountain trails. His early 50s demeanor reflected the permanent tan and steady presence of someone who had dedicated his professional life to protecting visitors in this wilderness environment, making his next revelation all the more significant. Hayes carried maintenance logs from the shelter cabins, but more importantly, he carried memories that would prove crucial to understanding what happened 5 years ago. His recognition of Emma wasn't casual. He remembered her specifically from trail registers as a consistent, safety-conscious hiker who always signed in properly, noted her expected return times, and represented the kind of responsible outdoor enthusiast that park personnel appreciate. This wasn't just vague recollection. This was the detailed memory of someone who paid attention to regular visitors. The mindset shift that occurred when Hayes revealed he had been on duty that specific day created a ripple effect through the entire investigation team. Here was a park employee who had been conducting routine maintenance on backcountry shelters along the exact routes Emma might have taken, yet somehow this crucial information had never been cross-referenced with the missing person case during the original investigation. The behind-the-scenes oversight that allowed this connection to remain hidden for 5 years represented a fundamental failure in investigative protocol. The impact of this revelation on Detective Santos was immediately visible. Hayes hadn't just been anywhere in the park system that day. He had been specifically working on the shelter network that Emma would have known about and potentially used if weather conditions deteriorated. His maintenance schedule placed him in direct proximity to the areas where a safety-conscious mother with a young child would seek refuge during unexpected storms. The journey toward understanding what this meant began with Hayes consulting his personal logs, documents that revealed a level of detailed record-keeping that went beyond standard Park Service requirements. These weren't just official duty rosters, these were comprehensive notes about trail conditions, shelter status, and the kind of environmental observations that experienced rangers accumulate over decades of fieldwork. The hidden truth that began emerging from Hayes's documentation was that the original investigation had focused on main trails and accident scenarios while completely overlooking the shelter system that represented Emma's most likely response to changing weather conditions. The transformation from missing persons case to criminal investigation suddenly had a witness who had been present in the exact locations where crimes might have occurred. The transformation in understanding what happened that day began with Hayes's detailed recollection of weather patterns that had been overlooked for 5 years. July 15th hadn't just been any ordinary summer day in the mountains. Hayes remembered it, specifically because unexpected weather had moved through the area during the afternoon, bringing enough rain to send unprepared hikers scrambling for cover. This wasn't severe storm activity, but it was exactly the kind of conditions that would concern a responsible parent hiking with a 3-year-old child. The mindset shift this created was profound. Emma, despite being thoroughly prepared for most hiking scenarios, would have prioritized Lucas's safety and comfort above all else. Rather than risk hiking with a toddler in deteriorating weather conditions, she would have sought shelter and waited for the storm to pass. This decision-making process was completely consistent with her safety-conscious approach to outdoor adventures, but it also meant she would have been in one of those remote shelters during the most vulnerable period of that day. The revelation about the shelter logbooks represented one of the most significant oversights in the original investigation. These documents hadn't been checked when Emma and Lucas first disappeared because the focus had been entirely on main trails and accident scenarios. Investigators had operated under the assumption that missing hikers would be found along established routes, not in the emergency shelter system that experienced hikers knew to utilize during unexpected weather events. The hidden truth about these logbooks became even more significant when Hayes revealed his personal role in preserving them. When the Park Service wanted to discard the old records during renovations 2 years prior, Hayes had intervened, believing they represented important historical documentation of trail usage patterns. His behind-the-scenes decision to keep these records had inadvertently preserved crucial evidence that could finally solve this case. The impact of this revelation on the investigation team was immediate and dramatic. Detective Santos realized they had been operating with incomplete information for 5 years, missing an entire category of evidence that could reveal who else had been in those shelters during the critical time frame. The journey toward truth was about to take a decisive turn based on documentation that almost didn't exist. Hayes's preservation of these records represented more than just bureaucratic thoroughness. It demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that comes from someone who truly understands the wilderness environment and the importance of maintaining comprehensive records. His transformation from helpful witness to potential key to solving the case was happening in real time as investigators began to understand the significance of what he'd saved. The transformation of Timber Creek Shelter from peaceful refuge to potential crime scene created an atmosphere of intense focus as the investigation team arrived at the first structure on their systematic search. This simple wooden building with its metal roof represented the kind of basic emergency shelter that had saved countless lives over the years, containing wooden bunks, a functional wood stove, and carefully maintained emergency supplies. But now, CSI teams were approaching it with entirely different intentions, dusting for fingerprints and checking for trace evidence that might have survived 5 years of exposure to mountain weather and countless other visitors. The reality of forensic investigation in wilderness settings became immediately apparent as technicians began their methodical work. After 5 years, the prospects for finding usable evidence were limited by environmental factors that indoor crime scenes never face. Rain, snow, temperature fluctuations, and the passage of hundreds of other hikers had potentially contaminated or destroyed crucial traces that might have solved this case much earlier. But Hayes's detailed memory of that specific day provided a level of insight that transformed how investigators understood these shelters' significance. His recollection of, specifically, checking all shelter locks because of the incoming weather revealed the kind of proactive safety mindset that experienced rangers develop over years of protecting visitors. This wasn't casual maintenance. This was systematic preparation for emergency conditions that could put hikers' lives at risk. The hidden truth about shelter safety protocols became evident as Hayes explained the potential dangers of malfunctioning lock mechanisms. Sometimes hikers accidentally engaged locks when leaving. These structures, or the mechanisms themselves, jammed due to weather exposure, potentially trapping people inside during emergencies. His decision to personally verify that every shelter remained accessible during deteriorating weather conditions demonstrated the behind-the-scenes dedication that keeps wilderness visitors safe. The impact of this revelation on David was profound. Here was evidence that at least one park employee had been thinking about hiker safety and emergency access during the exact time frame when Emma and Lucas disappeared. Hayes's proactive approach to shelter maintenance meant he would have encountered anyone seeking refuge during those afternoon storms, making his testimony potentially crucial to understanding what happened. The journey through Hayes's memories was revealing a level of detail about park operations that hadn't been explored during the original investigation. His transformation from routine maintenance worker to key witness was happening gradually. As investigators realized how his systematic approach to shelter management placed him in direct contact with the circumstances surrounding Emma and Lucas's disappearance. The transformation from one shelter to the next revealed subtle but significant differences in how these structures might have affected Emma's experience that day. Pine Ridge Shelter offered better valley views, which would have appealed to Emma's love of mountain photography and her habit of documenting their family adventures. As CSI teams continued their careful documentation process, David found himself imagining Emma and Lucas taking refuge here, perhaps with Lucas pressed against the windows watching the storm clouds roll across the valley below. Hayes consulted his worn notebook with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years tracking patterns in these mountains. His observations about Emma's typical hiking behavior and route preferences when traveling with young Lucas provided crucial insight into her decision-making process. This wasn't just casual record-keeping. Hayes had developed a comprehensive understanding of how different types of hikers use the trail system, and Emma's safety-conscious approach with her son made her particularly memorable. The journey to Avalanche Creek Shelter created an entirely different atmosphere that was immediately apparent to everyone in the search team. This most remote structure sat in a small clearing where the forest pressed, uncomfortably close, creating a sense of isolation that would make anyone feel vulnerable. The constant sound of rushing water from the creek that gave the shelter its name had an unintended consequence. It masked other sounds, making it impossible to hear approaching footsteps or voices until someone was already very close. The psychological impact of this location was profound. While the other shelters felt like safe refuges, Avalanche Creek Shelter had an unsettling quality that would heighten anxiety rather than provide comfort. The behind-the-scenes reality of wilderness safety is that isolation can quickly transform from peaceful solitude to dangerous vulnerability, especially when strangers arrive unexpectedly during severe weather conditions. The mindset shift that occurred as David stood in this remote clearing was visceral. He could imagine Emma's growing unease if she and Lucas had sought shelter here, only to have their sanctuary invaded by someone with malicious intent. The hidden truth about predators in wilderness settings is that they often target isolated locations where victims have nowhere to run and no hope of immediate assistance. Hayes's demeanor changed subtly as they approached this particular shelter, his professional confidence giving way to something that looked almost like reluctance. The transformation in his body language didn't go unnoticed by Detective Santos, who had spent years reading people's reactions to crime scene locations. There was something about Avalanche Creek Shelter that affected Hayes differently than the previous structures they'd examined. The transformation from searching remote shelters to investigating the ranger station created an entirely different energy in the case. While teams continued processing Avalanche Creek Shelter, Detective Santos received urgent radio communication about a breakthrough discovery back at the administrative center. A warrant-authorized search of employee areas had uncovered something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of who was responsible for Emma's death and Lucas's disappearance. The journey back to the ranger station felt endless as David processed what Santos had told him over the radio. Investigators had found items belonging to Emma in an unassigned employee locker, evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for years while everyone searched the wilderness for answers. The mindset shift from looking for external threats to discovering that danger had been within the park system itself was psychologically devastating. Locker 47 had belonged to Kyle Anderson, a former seasonal worker who had left abruptly in 2019, 2 years after Emma and Lucas disappeared. Inside this metal compartment, investigators discovered Emma's delicate silver compass necklace with its distinctive charm, the anniversary gift David had given her with their private inscription about always finding her way home. Next to it lay her backup wedding ring, the white, gold band with small diamonds she kept in her pack during hiking adventures. The hidden truth about Kyle Anderson began emerging through employment records and personnel files that painted a picture of someone who had deliberately remained invisible. This quiet man in his mid-20s had worked 2 seasons as a seasonal employee, living in park housing and keeping to himself in ways that made him nearly forgettable to his colleagues. The behind-the-scenes reality of seasonal employment meant that workers could move through the system without forming lasting relationships or leaving memorable impressions. The impact of Anderson's sudden departure became even more suspicious when investigators traced his post-employment activities. He had left without proper notice, claiming to have received a job offer in Utah, but since leaving the park system, he had completely disappeared from all normal channels of modern life. No current address, no employment records, no credit activity, no digital footprint. Anderson had gone off-grid with the thoroughness of someone deliberately avoiding detection. The revelation that Emma's most personal items had been kept as trophies in a park employee's locker created a chilling picture of calculated predation. These weren't random souvenirs. They were intimate reminders of a crime that someone wanted to preserve and revisit. The transformation from missing persons case to trophy-taking killer investigation required David to confront possibilities about Emma's final moments that were almost too horrific to consider. The transformation from hope to horror became complete when David examined Emma's compass necklace through the evidence bag. The engraving was still perfectly legible despite years of concealment. D&E. Always Find Your Way Home, 2015. This wasn't just jewelry, it was Emma's most treasured possession, the anniversary gift that represented their commitment to always finding their way back to each other no matter what challenges they faced. She had never hiked without it, considering it her good luck charm and constant reminder of their love. The psychological implications of trophy collection revealed a disturbing mindset that investigators were only beginning to understand. These items hadn't been taken randomly or discarded after the crime. They had been carefully preserved and hidden where Anderson could access them whenever he wanted to relive his actions. The behind-the-scenes reality of predatory behavior is that killers often keep mementos to maintain psychological connection to their victims and feed their need to dominate and control. But as David processed this devastating evidence, something else began nagging at his consciousness. Small details about Hayes's behavior throughout the investigation started forming a pattern that created an entirely different possibility. The ranger's detailed memory of Anderson was particularly troubling. Hayes claimed the seasonal worker was quiet and forgettable, yet he could recall specific details about Anderson's work habits, living arrangements, and departure that seemed inconsistent with someone who supposedly barely noticed him. The hidden truth about Hayes's involvement in the investigation itself was becoming increasingly suspicious. He had inserted himself into every aspect of the search, always staying within earshot of police communications, volunteering information and assistance with an eagerness that went beyond professional duty. His transformation from helpful witness to potential suspect was happening gradually in David's mind as inconsistencies accumulated. The impact of recognizing Hayes's unusual behavior created a chilling realization. This respected ranger with 15 years of service had been monitoring the investigation from the inside, potentially steering it away from evidence that might implicate him while simultaneously helping to frame Anderson. The journey toward truth was revealing that the most dangerous predators often hide behind badges and uniforms that grant them trust and access to victims. Hayes's intimate knowledge of shelter locations, trail patterns, and park operations made him the perfect person to commit these crimes while maintaining an appearance of authority and helpfulness. His mindset throughout the investigation had been that of someone protecting himself rather than seeking justice, using his position to control the narrative and misdirect suspicion toward a convenient scapegoat. The transformation from suspicion to certainty came through a late-night email that made David's blood run cold. Hayes had sent a message claiming to have discovered concerning items about Anderson in old employee files, requesting an urgent meeting at David's house to discuss evidence that Detective Santos should see immediately. The timing felt wrong. The request felt invasive, and every instinct David possessed screamed that this was dangerous. But Hayes was offering crucial evidence about Anderson that could potentially lead to Lucas, and that possibility made it impossible to simply ignore. The psychological manipulation behind Hayes's approach was masterfully calculated. He understood that a grieving father would take almost any risk for information about his missing son, and he exploited that vulnerability with precision. The behind-the-scenes reality of predators is that they study their victims carefully, learning exactly which emotional buttons to press to override logical safety concerns. David's mindset during those hours before the meeting was torn between rational fear and desperate hope. Part of him recognized the red flags in Hayes's behavior, but another part couldn't bear the thought of dismissing information that might finally lead to Lucas. The journey toward truth sometimes requires walking directly into danger, and David made the conscious decision to prioritize finding his son over protecting himself. When Hayes arrived at David's house that evening, he carried fabricated evidence designed to further implicate Anderson while deflecting suspicion from himself. The transformation from helpful ranger to calculating killer became evident as Hayes carefully prepared coffee for both of them, using the familiar ritual of hospitality to mask his true intentions. His demeanor remained calm and professional, even as he systematically drugged David's drink with a sedative that would leave him helpless. The revelation came as David's consciousness began slipping away. Hayes explained with chilling matter-of-factness that Anderson had simply been a convenient scapegoat, the perfect fall guy when authorities needed someone to blame for Emma's murder. The hidden truth that emerged was that Hayes had been planning this misdirection for years, keeping Emma's jewelry specifically to plant as evidence against Anderson when the time was right. The impact of realizing he had been manipulated by his wife's actual killer, while his body succumbed to chemical restraint, was David's worst nightmare made real. Hayes had used his position of authority and trust to get close to the investigation, all while protecting himself and preparing to eliminate the one person who had begun to see through his deception. The transformation from mysterious disappearance to horrifying truth came through Hayes's confession as David's consciousness faded. The revelation was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Hayes hadn't killed Emma in a moment of rage or opportunity, but rather as part of a calculated plan to steal Lucas for himself and his wife Jennifer. The behind-the-scenes tragedy that had motivated this crime was Jennifer's struggle with multiple miscarriages and severe depression that had nearly destroyed their marriage. Hayes explained with chilling calmness that he had encountered Emma and Lucas at Avalanche Creek Shelter during that afternoon storm 5 years ago. The isolated location had provided the perfect opportunity for him to present what he genuinely believed was a reasonable proposal, allowing him and Jennifer to adopt Lucas since they desperately needed a child and could provide him with a stable home. The mindset of someone who could rationalize kidnapping and murder as acts of kindness reveals a level of psychological distortion that defies normal understanding. The impact on Emma when she naturally refused this insane request had been immediate and violent. Hayes had used his knowledge of restraint techniques to kill her quietly while 3-year-old Lucas slept, then spent the following days methodically covering his tracks. He transported Emma's body to Crystal Springs under cover of darkness, understanding exactly how the thermal environment would destroy evidence while preserving certain materials that could later be planted to frame Anderson. The journey toward rescue began when Detective Santos, concerned about David's sudden silence after expressing suspicions about Hayes, had been monitoring his communications and location. When David failed to respond to calls and his phone showed movement toward remote areas outside normal cell coverage, she mobilized tactical teams for what would become a desperate race against time. The final confrontation at Hayes's family cabin revealed the complete scope of the deception. Police surrounded the remote structure where they found David bound inside while 9-year-old Lucas, now called Alex, sat in Hayes's truck, playing on an iPad, completely unaware that his entire life had been built on his mother's murder. The transformation of Lucas from missing child to rescued victim was complicated by 5 years of psychological conditioning that had convinced him Hayes and Jennifer were his loving parents. The hidden truth about Jennifer's involvement became clear during the standoff. She hadn't just been a passive recipient of Hayes's gift. She had been an active participant in maintaining the lie, helping to dye Lucas's hair, create false documentation, and eliminate threats to their secret. When a hiker had recognized Lucas from old missing person posters, Jennifer had been the one to push him off a cliff while Hayes established an alibi. The reunion between David and Lucas represents both an ending and a beginning. The end of 5 years of agonizing uncertainty, but the beginning of a long journey toward healing and rebuilding their relationship. Lucas, now 9 years old, had no memory of his father or his real name, calling himself Alex and asking why the people he thought were his parents were being arrested. The psychological recovery ahead would require patience, therapy, and an understanding that love sometimes means allowing someone to grieve the only life they've ever known, even when that life was built on tragedy. This case reminds us that the most dangerous predators often hide behind positions of trust and authority, using our natural inclination to respect uniforms and badges to gain access to victims. Hayes had spent 15 years building a reputation as a dedicated ranger while secretly planning and executing one of the most calculated crimes imaginable. The transformation from protector to predator can happen within institutions we trust most, making vigilance and intuition more important than ever. If this story has stayed with you the way it stayed with me, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. These deep dives into real mysteries and the psychology behind them take enormous research and care to present respectfully, and having you along for these journeys makes every moment of that work worthwhile. The connection we build through exploring these complex human stories is what drives me to keep uncovering truth in the darkest corners of human behavior. Drop a comment saying, "Justice for Emma," if you made it all the way through this incredible and heartbreaking case with me. Knowing you're there, processing these revelations, alongside me, creates the kind of community where we can examine difficult truths together while honoring the victims and survivors who deserve to have their stories told. That like button means more than you might realize. It tells me that this story resonated with you and helps ensure that other people seeking answers to unsolved mysteries can find content that treats these subjects with the depth and respect they deserve. There's a video right here that digs into another case where someone, in a position of trust, betrayed that responsibility in the most devastating way possible. Click and continue with me over there, because some stories demand to be understood, no matter how difficult they are to hear.